Hello, and welcome everyone to the Center for Environmental Policy and Energy Innovations series of webinars on a sectoral approach to climate mitigation. As some of you know, this is the last of 6 webinars that have been conducted over the spring. And what we're doing today is sort of having a roundtable discussion with 3 experts who are knowledgeable about sectoral approaches around the world. We are very fortunate to have Anand Gopal, who is Energy Innovations Executive Director for Policy Research. We have Elin Lerum Boasson, who studies a sectoral approach to climate change based in part in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where she has done a good bit of work, and also the University of Oslo, and Daniela Stevens, who's the director of the Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industries Program at the Inter-American Dialogue. Each of these colleagues will have some time to speak. I'm going to start very quickly situating the issue ever so briefly. And I hope to do that with a few slides here. I hope everyone can see them. All right, so I'm going to ask a few questions about how analysts have traditionally conceived of the problem of emissions in climate mitigation, talk about some of the shortcomings of that approach. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about broad lessons from the webinars so far, okay? As you can see from this climate analytics graph, there's a gap between current policies in the blue at the top and policies that would be consistent in green at the bottom, with an increase of only 1.5 degrees Celsius in global mean temperatures by the end of this century, and the measurement period is starting in the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 21st. In other words, we need, according to many scientists, to try to keep climate from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Okay, now to address this, the United Nations has set up an entire system under the Paris Agreement where nations pledge reductions in emissions. As you can see from this pie chart, China has the largest share of emissions, 29%. The United States is second, and with about 15%. Here we see these emissions based on per capita assessments rather than overall emissions. And here we see the United States is the worst emitter, followed by Russia and number 3, South Korea. The industrial countries have, the worst emissions, and we need to address the problem there more than elsewhere, of course. But the issue is that politically, it has been difficult to get nations to make the difficult choices of instituting policies which require large expenditures of resources in order to decarbonize, in order to reduce the amount of fossil fuels as a proportion of the energy generating sources. We have the technology to move to renewable energy sources. They are expensive, but the price is declining relative to the price of fossil fuels. And so it seems that we are perhaps on track if we take aggressive measures and spare no expense in order to start decarbonization. I should say, execute decarbonization and reach net zero emissions with a fully decarbonized worldwide economy later in this century. The aspiration is to try and reach what's called net zero by 2050. And some of our speakers will address this question directly. But I wanted to show a slide from the earlier presentation, the first presentation in this series by Robbie Orvis of Energy Innovation, which addresses, rather than just a country approach to emissions, but rather uses sectors as the unit of analysis. As you can see, this gives us a lot more information. The industry sector, the electricity sector, buildings, transportation, and agriculture are all prominent contributors of emissions, and we need to address the problem through these sectors as defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Water and waste is a sector which does not have as many emissions, and we haven't addressed that one explicitly. It accounts for some 3 or 4% worldwide, whereas industry can account for above close to 30%. So indeed, industry and energy or electricity generation are considered the most important sectors. And as we learned in this series of webinars, decarbonizing electricity will help not just in the energy electricity sector, but also in industry. We have solutions. That's the good news. The problem is that some particularly delicate processes, such as heating, iron, steel, and cement, remain challenges for finding substitutes for fossil fuels to engage in those processes. Other important sectors include the agricultural sector, buildings, and transport. As we learned in the webinar on land and agriculture, part of the problem there involves how do we measure and account for emissions from, say, rainforests, which is part of what's called the REDD+, which is where there's a focus on reforestation as part of solutions to the climate mitigation problem. Those questions seemingly can be solved, and we can talk about that as well. The other sectors in this slide, buildings and transportation, seem to have solid, actionable steps. The transportation sector has a few problems for finding ways forward, and those are probably shipping and air travel, which seem more complicated than transportation involving land vehicles, buses, private cars, trucks, which can all be converted to electric vehicles. So, overall, the good news is that we have solutions. Now, this was posed in part as a question of nation states versus a sectoral approach, and that's kind of a false dichotomy. The choice, of course, is not a binary one, but the idea of this webinar series has been to try and move us towards thinking more about sectors as ways forward, because it may offer solutions. The political negotiations in the United Nations have not succeeded in a large scale yet, and negotiations and diplomacy move slowly, and we don't have a lot of time to wait. And so we have our speakers here today to talk to us about the sectoral approach, which may present to us more concrete and incremental ways forward, and also highlight technologies and engineering rather than sort of political aspects of the problem. If we start with the engineering and technological problems, we may be able to find common cause by sector. We may be able to unite across countries and solve problems concurrently and with collaboration. And there's much discussion about this, and the time is ripe. So I thank you for indulging me that quick introduction. And I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker. I'm going to stop sharing and introduce Anand Gopal. And thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Todd. It's an honor to be part of this webinar. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here in a second. Great. It's great to be part of this webinar. Thank you. And I'm glad that many of my team members have presented over the course of the semester on various topics. I will focus my initial remarks just on sort of the way we think about why we do the work we do in the manner we do it, and energy innovation, also couched around how we've thought about various advantages and disadvantages of climate policy being focused around sectors. So just a quick summary of what I'm going to cover. I want to point out up front that multiple approaches to climate mitigation are important. We really have we should not be leaving various options on the table because it's such an urgent and important problem. We can't afford to fail, and therefore choosing one over the other may not always be the best thing. So if whatever your strengths are, leaning into that is a good thing in order to address climate. We focus on a sectoral approach because it enables governments to enact policies favoring rapid scaling of clean technologies. And that has many advantages and has also demonstrated success. So the outline I'm going to cover is really quickly to put back up the chart that Todd did and explain a few other things to complement what he covered, talk about what sectoral climate policies are and how and who designs them, a quick intro into this concept called Wright's Law. What is it and why does it matter for climate mitigation? So I'm putting this back up to point out a couple of things that drive how energy innovation does its work in the world. So just to be, you guys probably are already aware of this, whoever has participated in earlier seminars. Energy Innovation is a climate policy analysis think tank. And what we try to do is focus on speed and scale by advising climate policy decision makers with technical input so that they can make the strongest and most ambitious policy decisions on climate. So a classic example of that was some of the modeling we did for the Inflation Reduction Act last year, trying to isolate what are the most impactful provisions of that law in terms of emissions, but also complementary benefits that come out from increases in jobs and GDP and public health and air quality benefits. And that is informed where we focus on, which countries, which sectors by this chart, right? So we have a pretty large focus on China, and we have a large focus on industry and electricity. Why? You can see that from the chart, right? If you don't tackle industry and electricity in China and in most other countries, we are not on track to solve climate change. And so on and so forth. I just want to say that our focus on the US is also pretty important for several other reasons in addition to the sectoral emissions footprint. But we almost always start with the emissions footprint and then work our way backwards to what is important. And the reason we align it around sectors is because sectors have their own set of expert regulators and other policymakers, frequently people who are not necessarily elected officials, although in some cases they are, but they have their own governance structures. So working with existing governance structures means that we can enact sectoral climate policies that make a big difference to our emissions numbers at the end of the day. So what are good examples, right? You guys have probably seen all this through the various presentations that my directors have given over the course of the semester. But a classic example for clean electricity in the US that we see is the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And another variation of that is the Clean Electricity Standard that was discussed as part of the IRA last year for a bit. And the more common thing we now see enacted is production and investment tax credits for solar, wind, and other clean energy sources. In transportation, examples of sectoral policies are the EPA's greenhouse gas emission standards, which are incredibly important and have been around for a long time, actually. And one thing that I want to point out here is that sectoral climate policy has been around well before climate became a thing in transportation. A lot of the rules that the EPA has put forth initially applied to air pollution, and they were all part of authority vested in the EPA from the Clean Air Act. And therefore, it was mostly the job of regulators to translate that legislative authority into action. And so then applying it to climate was a bit more of a neater fit than trying to get legislation passed in 2008 and 2009 around a carbon tax. So there's a little bit of a political reason why also it's easier to use existing authorities like we have with the Clean Air Act. And then we have another example of the California Zero Emission Vehicle Program. China has a similar program, also essentially requiring the number of share of zero emission vehicles to increase as a share of sales each year, and that's called the China New Energy Vehicle Program, or NEV as they call it. And then the other one that you're familiar with, probably with the passage of the IRA, is electric vehicle tax credit. Moving to buildings, you might have heard around the country in the US, and in fact now this is proliferating in Europe and China as well, is this concept of all electric building codes for new construction, trying to make sure that all new buildings are built with only electric operation. And then the most impactful things that we find actually are standards that can impinge on appliances and make them zero emission, as well as tax credits that you see from IRA for heat pumps and other home retrofits to going electric. Really important thing here is that the equipment in the house that burns gas is the key thing to switch out for the biggest bang for the buck in terms of emissions reduction. Other complementary things would be helpful, like weatherization and insulation, to make those things work better. But if you don't make that switch first, doing all the weatherization and everything else is going to be insufficient. And industry, which is a very large sector, and Todd alluded to the fact that some parts of it is hard to address. Good news, there's a lot of stuff that was even in the Designing Climate Solutions book written by our founder, Hal Harvey and Robbie Orvis and Jeff Risman, that we now in 4 years down the line have now found solutions. So the technology side is moving pretty fast. And here are some examples of things that can work on the industry side. An interesting thing I'll draw your attention to is that the Inflation Reduction Act has production tax credits for green hydrogen, and using that for ammonia production will make a pretty large impact in reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And ammonia is a pretty important ingredient for fertilizers. So that's where it links with waste and with agriculture. So the question is, those are examples of the policies, but who are the people who design and enact sectoral climate policy? A large share of those are experts in government, mostly civil servants. And this expertise is really valuable to us. It's valuable not only in the US, the examples here are for the California Air Resources Board or the Environmental Protection Agency, but also the European Commission, the US Department of Energy for Standards, and now a few others I haven't mentioned, like China's Ministry for the Energy and Environment, or MEE, or MIIT, which regulates vehicles in China. And also expert staff of elected officials. So the other thing to keep in mind is once you have elected officials, they're supported by a large number of really good expert staff in most cases. Senators and congressional representatives have really great staff. And the White House Climate Policy Office is another example, as well as state legislators. The reason I point this out is you'll notice that the theme running through here is the folks who are in charge of climate policy that I've listed here are essentially a bit humbler. They're not always in the news. They're not the ones who are covered in terms of like what their stances are on political issues X, Y, or Z, but more along the lines of just dedicated to their expertise. And that is something that's an important thread here. If you pull on the thread of finding solutions that are economic and technology forcing into the ecosystem, essentially climate is a problem of getting clean technology to displace dirty stuff fast. And when you do that, you're able to address it. And yes, it may be suboptimal from an economics point of view, not to have just a carbon price that does it. It does work out quite well from a political point of view because technologies that are addressing climate change have these incredible features of being ones that are a transformation in the way we are using energy, and therefore have this incredible potential to have rapid price drops once they get deployed in the world. And the people who have control over deploying that in the world are the policymakers who are not necessarily in the political limelight. And what they do, if, for example, the EPA sets a vehicle standard for greenhouse gases that are strong, and essentially asks automakers to invest in, produce, and sell electric vehicles, that action of getting more electric vehicles into the world means that there's more battery production essentially in the world. And what that does is it unleashes something that is known as Wright's Law. And this is an incredible feature of sectoral climate policy that people didn't really understand when they started working on it, to be frank, more than a decade ago. I've been working on climate policy for 2 decades, and I had a good sectoral orientation, but I didn't quite understand the power of Wright's Law when we started working on vehicle standards or clean electricity standards and all of these other things. What is Wright's Law? Wright's Law is that work by an American aeronautical engineer who discovered this phenomenon when studying the cost of building airplanes during wartime, right? So essentially what it is technology costs decline with cumulative doubling of global production, and they do so reliably once a technology has reached commercial maturity. And some technologies don't learn fast and others do learn fast. If you lean in on just the ones that learn fast, which means that their cost reliably drops rapidly as global deployment increases, Oxford University came up with an interesting finding that if policymakers leaned in on clean technology today, the fact that that alone would induce cost drops would make energy so much cheaper that the transition to have a cleaner world in 2050 is $12 trillion cheaper than not doing anything at all, essentially like letting the transition unfold on its own and having a fossil heavy energy system. So this flips climate wisdom on its head. We think about it as high upfront costs and major costs in the early stage, and the rewards are for future generations or even for us like several years down the line. But now with the way the pricing has changed with Wright's Law, we're actually seeing a reversal. It's cheaper to mitigate and clean the world than it is to keep it dirty, which is an interesting fact, right? So I just want to highlight a few technologies that are very important here. Solar PV and wind. Those black dots are what has actually happened. This is a log linear graph. So the straight line means it's exponentially dropping every year. Those black dots are what actually happened with solar PV prices. Those red lines are what expert modeling groups like the IEA and others projected as what would happen. And so every single year, actual price drop has been greater and faster than projected price drops, right? And the same has been true for wind. And what the Oxford University researchers have found is that if you just look to the past to project out to the future, like they do in the blue lines over there, then you're going to have a more reliable likelihood of what's going to happen rather than limit that kind of price drops that we're seeing in solar PV and wind. Batteries is another example, pretty significant drops in the last decade. And again, all those red lines showing you how pessimistic all the projections were. And in the end, the reality has been better, right? And this doesn't have the same kind of history of cost in electrolyzers, but we're seeing that as well in that technology. How does this compare with what we know for fossil fuels? Pretty flat. And the reason it's pretty flat, we'll get to this in a bit, is because when you have technologies that are have lower degree of design complexity and have a less need for customization, you find that those learn pretty fast. And if you have very large degrees of complexity, as well as like field assembly and customization in the field, those don't learn very fast. And the problem with oil and gas is that they're in that sort of top right quadrant here. They are actually not modular. And most of the time, over the course of the 2 centuries that we've used these technologies, we've ended up in a situation where, yes, there'll be technological progress in drilling, but then the extraction becomes harder, and that offsets those price gains. So there's some kind of mitigating effect between the technology getting better and the fact that the extraction of the resource is getting harder. We don't have that problem with renewables. And so in reality, we are in a new era in which if we shift over to using electricity more and more as a fuel, we can go to faster and faster price drops, but we need to have deployment. Remember, the goal is not just to have the world transform to clean energy. The goal is to do it fast enough to address climate change. So I'll conclude by saying a few things here. One of the things that has worked for sectoral climate policies is that they create markets for clean technologies that have proven to be politically more viable at the time of enactment. And then by enacting deployment-based policies on clean energy technology, you get a virtuous cycle of economic and political tailwinds, whereby the early deployment of the clean technology makes it easier for stronger policy support over time. And then the fast learning technologies also build confidence in the policymaker that public support can end sooner rather than later. If you have a world where the upfront prices of all of the energy services that we use is cheaper than the fossil alternative, they can sustain on its own and people will keep going and buying those, right? I want to end with a couple of caveats. Look, this is not a universal story. The last 20% of getting to net zero emissions is still high cost. And we don't yet have proven fast learning technologies that address all greenhouse gas emissions. But if we get going on that first 80 really quickly, essentially we're building a lot of political momentum while cutting emissions at speed and scale, right? So the key is to get better at identifying which technologies hold maximum promise for fast learning at an early stage so that we can solve the climate crisis cheaper and faster. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very instructive in adding another important reason to study the sectoral approach, which is sort of the regulatory networks and norms that come to play there. And also thanks for your very optimistic view of changes in costs and structure based on the structures of renewables versus the structure of fossil fuels. I'm looking forward to reading the paper that you cite in your slides, and so thanks. And next, I'd like to introduce Elin Lerum Boasson, who is joining us from Oslo this evening. Thank you so much for joining us as the evening gets later, and we're very appreciative that you could spend some time with us this evening. And I will pass to her. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. Let me just find my presentation here. Okay. So I will give more of a political science perspective, but I will talk about many of the same things, but from another angle. I am a professor in political science at the University of Oslo, but also at Sectoral, and I worked in this last assessment cycle. I've been a lead author in the IPCC. So I will draw on all of these experiences in my presentation. So I thought that I first would say something about the actual role of sectoral climate governance, because in the IPCC, it's been a long, like several decade-long conflict about which is the best approach to climate policy and governance. Is it an approach where you develop a carbon price that's similar for all sectors, or is it a more sector-specific approach? This has been an ongoing dispute, often with different conclusions in different parts of the IPCC reports. But in this last assessment cycle, I think we developed clearer conclusions about these things than we had done before. So for the most important thing is that we have never done as much climate governance as we do today. And in many countries, it seems like the policies also work. And it has, during a very short time period, become very popular to have zero emissions targets way into the future, but also more concrete climate laws. But when it comes to the specific climate policy instruments, sector-specific policies win clearly over climate pricing when it comes to what's the most popular approach to climate governance. So the absolutely most popular type of policy is renewable energy support schemes, which is a sector-specific policy. And even after the IPCC have, since the late 90s, recommended carbon pricing as the main way of approaching this, and that the carbon price should be similar in all sectors, it's still only 20% of the emissions in the world that's covered by a carbon price. And this is very disappointing for those that have promoted this approach. And we do not conclude that this approach does not work. It's just that it's not happening in the extent that it needs to happen. We also, like in the IPCC report, we concluded that climate policy actually work for many of the same reasons that we heard about when it comes to how the sector-specific policies have changed the prices of renewables. But also when we have a country perspective, we see that it's at least 18 countries and maybe more countries that have cut emissions for more than 10 years. Now, US is one of these countries, apparently not for policy reasons, maybe profiting from policies that other countries have introduced of a sector-specific character, but still, it's no doubt that sector-specific measures are effective. And the new conclusion that is presented in the last assessment cycle is that we need complex policy packages. So at this stage, I think even the most kind of the environmental economists that have invested the most in a belief in carbon price believe that we need to combine that measure with a sector-specific approach. Okay, so that's the facts, that sector-specific climate policy, that is what is actually happening on the ground. But in the literature on climate governance, I think there are at least 3 different ways of understanding climate governance. That develops different standards we can use to say if it's a good climate governance or not. And I've already mentioned that environmental economics has been an important producer of thoughts about how to govern climate change. And it is no doubt the oldest and most established way of approaching climate governance is from an environmental economist approach. But we have increasingly authors and scholars that focus on industry development as the core aspect, and that is often aligned with a technology-specific and a sector-specific approach. Recently, my own discipline, political scientists, even though some of us have studied this for many decades, it's quite recent that we have actually connected climate governance to the key areas of political science, which relates to democracy and how to gain popular support and create good governance processes. So I think you can argue that it's kind of a triangle where the environmental governance, the environmental economists approach rely on science to provide inputs. And if the IPCC or other climate scholars say that it's urgent, we need to act, then the politicians will respond, and they will respond by creating a price that change how the markets work. Alternatively, you can have an industry change approach where you focus more on the socio-technological systems, and you focus on changes in the power structures among different industries. And what will drive climate governance is a change in the power structure in the society, so that the corporations that gain their money from climate pollution reduce their power, and those that gain money from producing low carbon and green solutions get more clout over policy development. And then the last part of the triangle is how to ensure popular support. And I know that this is not the main topic today, but I think it is something we have paid far too little attention to in the whole scientific community. And it is like just the last 5 years, we finally have understood that there are really limits to what we can do, no matter what instruments we introduce, if we do not have a popular support for the climate transition. So you can say that we have kind of a correcting market failure approach. That will be the environmental economist approach, recommending carbon pricing, focusing on science and experts. And it's important to depoliticize and take climate out of political discussions like you've done with the central banks. And here there is a belief that you should initially start with shallow emissions reduction, and then you should, it's an incremental increase in the acceleration of climate transition. But this approach relies on a monocentric global governance where you have a strong international regime, and that has not happened. We now have the Paris Agreement, which is not a strong monocentric international regime. So this alternative approach, which relies much more on sector-specific approaches, is more has gained traction, where you believe that we need technological specific measures, we need state aid. So it used to be Germany that was the flag carrier for this approach in the real world, but I guess with the new climate policy in the US kind of taken over, this approach taken to the extreme, also not always in line with WTO rules. And here you will, of course, expect an uneven emission reduction patterns across sectors, because which sectors that reduce emissions will depend on which sectors that you target politically. If you think that the key to climate transition is to spur popular support, then you need to develop policies that people like. That probably means that you need to do things that are not cost efficient in the short term. But it's a bit unclear if this will result in sector-specific policies. Because in this measure, it's more about empowering. In this approach, it's more about empowering the people. And you could, I think, criticize this sector-specific technology-focused approach of ignoring the legitimate arguments from workers that will lose their jobs when you have changes in industry structure. And that there are some legitimacy and justice issues related to this spurring technological change approach that we need to take seriously. But it's definitely this approach that puts the spurring technological change approach that puts more weight on sector-specific focus. So it's more aligned to the topic that we're discussing today. I recently published a special issue of a Journal of European Public Policy with Mikael Tattam, where we and many other contributors go quite deep into the implications of these three different models. But I think there are many promising sector-specific explanatory frameworks that have been developed during the last decade or so. In human geography or transition studies, or this have many names, the multi-level perspective of Frank Giels as a political it has gained quite a lot of momentum and attention. As a political scientist, I get some feelings of anxiety when I see this many arrows in a drawing. But I think there is something to learn from this approach, focusing on niche innovations, leading to socio-technological regime change, and in the end, change at a very high societal level. And Frank Giels and collaborators have increasingly started to use political science frameworks. So there is definitely a room for more dialogue across the disciplines. Myself, I am drawing on many sociologists have developed a multi-field approach to this, focusing on It is a sector-specific approach focusing on it that all countries will have. So for instance, relating to electricity, there will be a specific organizational field in every country, or in the US at the state level, and there will differ when it comes to who has the power, depending on how the sector or the organizational field is organized. If there's a lot of small corporations, or if you have also bigger corporations, and how strong the links are to between regulators and corporations. So I guess I have not time to dwell on everything, but this approach is more a sociological approach, focusing on that we have to take both kind of the cultural understandings of the different fields and sectors into account, and also the political steering, and in Europe, the role of the EU in order to understand the sector-specific climate policy developments we have seen. And if you're more interested in our big comparative project from some years back on comparative renewables policy, where we explain why you have so different approaches to renewables across Europe, you can look up our book. But this framework that we'll develop in this book, I think can also be used for other sectors, not only energy and electricity, even though that's what we do in this book. But there are other approaches that focus more on political economy, and Kathy Hochstetler's recent book, where she compares this wind and solar power in Brazil and South Africa. That's also quite a complex framework, where she argued that there are actually 4 different political economies that you have to take into account in order to understand sectoral climate policy development. But this is also a promising approach that could be applied to other sectors than energy. I just wanted to mention also the work of Matto Mildenberger that pays more attention to labor unions. And maybe in the US, labor unions is not always very important, but in Europe it is. We did the review in IPCC, and I also did a recent review elsewhere, where we find that we know far too little about the role of labor unions. And I think this is a crucial emission or hole in the literature. So Matto Mildenberger is very negative to the role of labor unions. Others are very positive, and we don't really know much about the actual role and how this varies across sectors and countries. I'll just say a little bit about the IPCC, because in an ideal world, I would have wanted the IPCC to provide much more guidance on what to do in different sectors. But there are limits to what IPCC can do, because we are governed by a panel of policymakers. And there are some powerful countries that do not want very detailed policy advice. And the word policy is kind of toxic even in IPCC. So we're supposed to be neutral with respect to policy. And it's not a very good understanding of, I think it's very possible to develop neutral conclusions about which policies that work, but not everyone in the IPCC system will agree with that. And also the working group structure. You see working group 3, that's the working group in the IPCC that work with the mitigation issues. Here you have sector-specific chapters organized like this. You say that there are sector-specific chapters that assess the literature on energy, land use, urban buildings, transport, and industry. But there are very few policy scholars involved. We rather have 2 specific chapters devoted to policy and politics. And it was just no space in those chapters to present state-of-the-art knowledge of how to govern different sectors in the most efficient ways. I think I'll just move to a last slide here, just going back to my 3 models, that I think we need to think more about the role of the state in accelerating climate action. And I think that all of the 3 approaches that I mentioned initially will give some insights to how to ensure acceleration of climate action and to do sector-specific climate governance. And we probably need also to learn more about the interrelationship between them. And we should not lose the old message from the climate economists that we don't want this to be more costly than it has to be. So cost efficiency is also important, but the time perspective is often longer than what it is possible to include in easy calculations about these challenges. Thanks.
Thank you for that very informative and sort of very precise discussion of the three approaches to governance that you outlined. And we appreciate very much your perspective as a practitioner negotiating and working with the IPCC, as well as a scholar analyst. So thank you very much. And also for mentioning some of the evolution in political science and including the pillar of the three pillars of public support, which also includes the need for further studies of interest groups and the sort of the distributive conflict aspect, which is coming out in some of the work that you cited increasingly. So fascinating, and I wish we had a few more hours for this webinar. But on that note, I would like to introduce our third speaker today, Daniela Stevens, who's the director of the Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industries program at the Inter-American Dialogue, who also has extensive experience as a professor of international politics and climate politics in CIDE in Mexico City, and who will bring a new perspective to our conversation. So thank you very much, Dr. Stevens.
Thank you, Todd. Thank you for having me. Congratulations on this successful series. I'll share a quick reaction to Anand and Elin's interventions and look forward to having some time for the Q&A. So starting with Anand's intervention, that makes sense and presents an optimistic and ideal scenario from an economic perspective. I'd like to add what you just mentioned, Todd, the political economy perspective that Elin also referenced briefly, which takes into account political and economic interests and explains why, despite expectations or despite what we really need, we are behind in on our emission reduction commitments globally and even sectorally in the energy transition. And for my first intervention, I will limit my comments to the power sector, and I'll draw a few examples also from agriculture. So experience curves that Anand very eloquently shared and instructed represent technology costs, deployment rates, and they are typically seen as the main factors in the global energy transition to clean energy sources. The story is linear, causal. Anand said this is not universal, but nonetheless, it tries to depict a cause-effect story, that production costs fall as technology adoption rises. In other words, that more deployment leads to cheaper costs. And Anand also gave us some heartening evidence that this is indeed the case. These curves, however, do not consider politics, which I will argue is the critical dimension of technology experience curves, as politics affect both costs and deployment. So it is argued that lower costs also increase political will and feasibility, which is true. However, political conflict often surrounds clean energy adoption across a variety of technologies and even policies and regulations. So conflict between incumbent and newcomer technologies shapes costs and deployment at different stages along this experience curve, which again is not linear. The political institutions and conditions that support the rise of new technologies into the economic winners that we expect are not always the same in different countries for different technologies. So we cannot understand the emission reduction pledges linked to energy, for example, without acknowledging this coevolution of technology, policy, politics, as well as other contextual factors. And my experience is in Latin America. And I can think of a few other contextual factors as macroeconomic instability and even organized crime. In a stylized format, not mine, authored by Breeds, Mildenberger, and Stokes. Elin quoted Mildenberger as well. We can analyze this experience curve in 3 market-oriented stages of technological deployment. The first is early research, demonstration, the pre-commercial maturity. And this occurs when global deployment is low of a specific technology and the cost of new technologies is higher than incumbent technologies. The second stage is a supported commercial maturity, supported by the state, or the middle of the curve, when the cost of new technologies allows niche adoption and an initial market formation. And the third is a fully commercial market, or the bottom of the curve, when new technologies become cost competitive. So this is why a sectoral approach can be helpful. It can help us further dissect different stages of these experience curves on different technologies, on different sectors. And success not only depends on each sector, but on the stage of adoption of each technology. Going back to politics, when new technologies costs are higher than existing technologies, energy transitions need political coalitions willing to support these new technologies and initial commercialization, creating new economic winners and the clean energy constituencies that they need. The politics and the policies needed at the middle of the experience curve are different, and perhaps more conflict can be expected from incumbents with the power and resources to sway politics or delay them or make or break coalitions, but also in a more optimistic perspective, to embed themselves in the group of the winners. We have the example of fossil fuel companies now that are investing in offshore wind development, in SPV, and coming up with different scenarios for the energy transition and how they can thrive in a transformed energy world. On the third stage, we can expect less resistance and an easier coalition formation process. And Brazil is perhaps, Elin also mentioned Brazil is perhaps a good example. In the 1970s, after the oil crisis, the agro industry and the government invested heavily in the creation of biofuels, of a biofuels market that resulted in economic benefits, but also in energy self-sufficiency to avoid geopolitical oil shocks. And they did so very successfully because of the government's drive to guarantee energy security. The biofuels and the hydropower sector also received ample support and did not face opposition from other sector incumbents. Decades later, in the 90s, in the 2000s, the incumbent biofuel industry lobbied heavily against the development of SPV and wind energy to retain dominance. Because we are already in the third stage of the experience curve that I mentioned, we tend to discount the need to build these political coalitions in addition to demonstrating economic viability. And regarding different economic groups or interest groups, as you mentioned, Todd, their influence will vary by country, by sector, and that will depend on a number of factors, such as the unity of the business community, on how salient the issue is in the eyes of the public, the degree of media scrutiny, as well as on their direct ties with national and local governments. But as the scale of adoption moves from niches to systems, which is what we aim for, new political coalitions are necessary to push system-wide technology. Of course, spurred by predictable institutions, government incentives, coalitions combining groups of interests in environmental protection, finance, even real estate that can support these new entrants. And integrated global markets can propitiate this complementarity, or that is, different countries can contribute to different steps in the transition as a function of their individual comparative political advantages. Unfortunately, there is also more evidence about the causal story behind experience curves in the developed world and in the developing world. So my suggestion here is to pay attention to distributed politics, which are highly relevant to clean energy. The cost of renewables are predominantly private, not evenly distributed. The costs include financial investments, which may be passed on to taxpayers or electricity payers, as well as other negative externalities like job losses. The final point I want to make is that we must be careful also to avoid using sectoral approaches as a distraction. What do I mean by this? I've referenced mainly the energy sector, but tackling the power sector is not always what is most direly needed. In Latin America, again, for example, land use and land change is the main source of emissions. The government sanctioned, the government authorized expansion of the agricultural frontier is the main source of emissions. And there is evidence of organized crime involvement in forest invasive activities such as cattle ranching. So countries like Brazil may boast their adoption of technologies and expansion of renewables, while their land use sectoral emissions are more domestically guarded and have been historically very reluctant to discuss in an international forum. In the Latin American region, factors such as governmental development plans inspired by resource nationalism, like in Mexico, by the need and the right to use their natural resources to develop, like in Argentina or Ecuador and parts of the Caribbean. Reactionary policymaking in Brazil, for example, under Bolsonaro, in Mexico, under AMLO, influence heavily sector-based emission reduction commitments. So taking into account these cycles of resource nationalism and pendulums between right and left is critical to manage risks and to consider risks before an investment. So in sum, learning rates, so important in experience curves, tend to be a black box where issues like learning by doing, economies of scale, capital investments matter. My invitation is to complement those important items with the observation that distributed politics is a key factor that determines the speed and the scale of the transition. Price, quantity, deployment, all that is driven by economic, but also by political factors. And it's important that we remember that adoption is not linear. And certainly the transition process is not irreversible either. Sectoral reforms will likely require broad coalitions because they have to have enough support and sustained for long enough to transform systems. Even in cases where innovation is driving long-term movement shifts in cost, in capacity, political factors still shape the timing, if not the direction of the change. And such rate, such timing, as we know, is extremely consequential for environmental outcomes in the face of global climate change. Elin gave us a good example of the politicization of central banks, which gives a glimmer of hope that climate policy could be depoliticized. But unfortunately, I see in Latin America that we're still far from that. What I also see is a very fertile area of intersection between what Elin shared and Anand shared from a political science perspective on the one hand, and from a technical and economic perspective on the other. I will leave my comments here and look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you again for the invitation. Todd, we cannot hear you. Todd, you're mute.
Thanks, Daniela, for adding these caveats about sort of relative position of different political groups in national systems as being important also for consideration, and for your comments. I think now what I would like to do is open the conversation. If any of the audience members would like to ask questions, we can field those. And while you in the audience, the virtual audience, are coming up with your questions, I guess I would start with one for whoever would like to take it, which is perhaps the idea that what we're talking about in the sectoral approaches more than anything is industrial policy. And the question may be, how do we promote clean industries and how do we substitute for dirty ones in a worldwide environment as mitigation requires, without as much regard for corporate profits and national benefits as we seem to operate in for the most part. In other words, how do we integrate more fully the need for these clean energy policies and promotion into existing structures, such as the trade regime, such as it is, or other institutions? How do we move towards a broader and more collective view of solving this problem, despite the fact that we have motivations based on history that are to pursue profits and benefits to individuals, companies, and the nations where they pay taxes. So I guess I would open that up, and in the meantime, please, if you have other questions you would like to ask each other as panelists or additional comments you would like to make, please go ahead. Yeah, Elin.
Thank you. There's so many things we could say. I just wanted to emphasize after it was great comments from Daniela, that of course it's very, very skewed, the research we have. We have so much research on Germany and a few other European countries. And there is so many, and we have quite a lot of research on China these days, but very few other countries. So there is so many countries in the world we know so little about. And it's not even clear which driving factors that will be the same across countries and which will be specific. And this also goes for sectors, because we know quite a lot about the electricity sector, but there are many other sectors we know less about. And also in some countries, it will be all about forestry and agriculture, which is the sector that we have just started to understand. But at least one thing that I sense is happening in the literature is that we are really walking away from focusing on the ideal way of designing single instruments, and rather focusing on the whole machinery of government and how to set up the government. And it's many more people acknowledge that climate policy will not work if we do not take into account that many other regulations and issues exist already, and then climate comes on top of that. Yes, I think at least the discussion is moving in the right direction, but maybe not fast enough to facilitate the transition.
Yeah.
May
If
I
I
add
may-
something? Go ahead, Daniela, it's fine.
Thanks, Anand. So addressing your questions of how to integrate this more broadly, I see a good role roles that must be fulfilled by the government on the one hand and by the private sector on the other. Let me start with the governments. Governments, especially in emerging markets, must offer protection and long-term certainty to investors, regardless of government turnover. Sort of what USMCA did with energy, locking in the energy reforms in Mexico. So certainly that the project goes regardless of electoral cycles of resource nationalism typical in the region. Another important set of policies is creating more fiscal space to make more green investments without lowering other investments for development and without simply rebadging them. What used to be investment in transportation, now they're tagging it as green investment. That's not the case. There is no new money. Other countries like Colombia have implemented green taxonomy, which are criteria to determine if an investment is sustainable, using different targets to evaluate assets or projects that meet climate and sustainability objectives, closely tied to ESG standards, with, of course, a special attention to the E. And green taxonomies are relatively new, but they're rapidly gaining a reputation as a crucial guidebook for governments, for investors, because they let investors know what is the ESG landscape of the jurisdiction they want to invest in. And they let investors and governments know that the money will be invested in genuinely sustainable efforts and not merely on greenwashing. A redesign of carbon taxes would be ideal, making them not only higher price, but covering all the sectors that should be covered, including natural gas, which most of carbon taxes in the regions exclude. And working with private and financial sectors to identify how to de-risk policy instruments, such as regulatory capacity building, streamlining processes, adjudicating institutional responsibilities, and also financial instruments. And here's where the private and financial sectors come in to complement and back up PPPs, which are very useful, but not a panacea. international and national development institutions, and even the private financial sector can provide instruments such as partial loan guarantees, political risk insurance. And again, I'm referencing emerging markets and regions where there is a perception of a very high risk to invest on energy transition and sectoral policies.
Well, thank you. Anand?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I have to caveat this by saying I'm a bit of a fallen academic. I finished my PhD at Berkeley like more than a decade ago and did some work in the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab before moving over to running a climate policy think tank. And I reference that because we're sort of our hands are deep in the dirty work of trying to move policy forward given the realities of the world as they are. And over time, I realized that we try not to make the perfect the enemy of the really good, right? Mm-hmm. You try to make progress where it's possible, and of course step back. In fact, wisdom from folks like you guys who have the ability to study and take a step back and study the trends and outcomes are like really important for us. So I learned a lot from the other panelists today, particularly around how to think about the politics of the transition, and also Daniela's characterization of the 3 stages of how to look at the experience curve. The thing that I'll add is I think it's really important to think about the various ways in which you can have more fundamental transformations of the economy and the world as we address climate change. And if we don't get all of that, that doesn't mean that the current approaches are not something we need to lean in heavily on, right? And so the reality is that what we find for climate as a technology transition is so much more steeper than anything the world has ever seen. Like it took something like 50 years for the horse cart to completely get replaced by vehicles that run on engines. We don't have 50 years in order to do that with electric vehicles from internal combustion engines. So even when you get to stage 3 on the experience curve for climate, you still need massive policy intervention. It isn't just enough if the incumbent technology is more expensive or there's widespread uptake. The adoption level is 50, 60% insufficient. We need to go where the S-curve levels off between 80 and 100%. You still need to go gangbusters. You can't afford to like slow this down. And so one of the things that the realities of what we deal with is climate is such an accelerant or decelerant of every other social issue that even if we solve it imperfectly, in terms of like looking at technology substitutions for the services and lifestyles that people are used to, we should do it. And it's possible. Like that's the thing from an engineering background that people typically fail to understand is if you move to electrification, you're moving beyond combustion. The Industrial Revolution was a transition from uncontrolled fires to controlled fires. If you move to solar, wind, and other ways of generating electricity, even nuclear or geothermal or everything else, you are then moving towards direct to work technologies, meaning that directly provide electricity services for end uses, whether it's motive power or heating or whatever else you want to use, including in industry. In fact, high temperature heat can be provided by direct electric technologies easily, actually. It's just a question of whether we have the political will and the policies to be able to deploy that. And when you look at it that way, you can service the current needs of the world energy-wise with 40% less energy use at the end. Right. And so I think it's important to have this yes and perspective. People think about climate as a major sacrifice and that things that you'll have to like have major lifestyle changes in order to achieve this. All that does is it just makes it less popular to pass the policy. People don't want major lifestyle changes or anything like that. So I'm for all of those things. You want to make it faster. And at the same time, it's important not to complicate the process too much and sort of introduce like so many different variables and that you have to solve every labor problem and every other problem in order to address climate change. It's better to sort of go with what's working and then always take a step back and look for better ways to continue the process, essentially.
Yes, thank you, Elin. And also, just as you start, let me just introduce a question that we have about the idea of that we have barriers that we're facing as in part about interest groups and lobbyists, and how do we overcome those? That's the question we have, but you may want to address that question or something stated earlier, Elin. So please, thank you.
Yeah, Yeah, that was exactly. I saw the questions in the chat, but just first, I just want to, Anand, you mentioned about this trying to achieve the optimal, and that that can be problematic and actually hinder change. And I think that is actually what has happened a lot in climate politics, that there have been a widespread belief that it's possible to calculate in advance how to do this in the optimal, cost-efficient way. But this is a transition of such a scale that that's not possible. And it's just puzzling if you compare to other major scientific endeavors like fighting cancer, for instance. No one really talks about what's the most cost-efficient way of fighting this specific type of cancer, right? You try to heal the patient, and it's something very special with how we talk about climate change. And then lobbyists. So I think, so in the US and also in the literature from the US, it's a very black and white picture about evil lobbyists hindering things, which to an extent reflect how climate policy have developed in the US. But this is not the general picture. In EU, we have had, at least for the last 12, 15 years, conflicts between different groups. So there are some industry actors that promote change and some that want to hinder change, and a lot of industry actors that don't know exactly what their economic interests are. And this is an issue where it's hard to use standard political science theory, because people don't know what their economic interest will be a few years down the line. But we also, and in the IPCC, I was very disappointed that we were not able to get included in the summary for policymakers. That the literature indicates quite strongly that lack of democracy and problems with corruption makes it harder to develop good climate governance. And for the US, which is, well, your democracy and your level of corruption seem to be worrying, and the direct link between money and policymakers makes it specifically challenging for the US to deal with climate change at this moment in time.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out from the European perspective. I think in the US, we don't often acknowledge that sufficiently, that, you know, the difficulties here, the democracy here is delicate too, and we've taken it for granted, and that affects how we mitigate. I think we're running short on time, but I want to just see if anyone would like to make a last comment or two, and just to thank you again, and to thank Energy Innovation for co-sponsoring these webinars, to encourage people to go to their website, and also the Center for Environmental Policy should have postings of the videos from each of these webinars within about a week. So we'll wait to get the last one, and then we'll post those, and we will send those to Energy Innovation as well. Any last comments?
I'd like to highlight the importance of reframing the energy transition as having benefits for all parties included, including the fossil fuel industry, including the companies that we usually frame as the villains. They have an important role to play, natural gas, and they will see benefits of moving on with the transition. So framing it as you can rise as a winner of this new energy system is important to stop the characterization of this evil lobbyist, but also to get everyone on board. And also I'd like to thank you again for having me, and thank my co-panelists for such an interesting discussion.
Okay, on that then, thank you all very much for joining us, and we'll close these webinars and look forward to seeing you soon.